So I'm Kevin, and I'm from Brooklyn. I have a game design company there. We do a lot of different things, and some of them are, to some degree, conventional. And I'm just going to open with one of them just to make a point. This is something that we just launched about a week ago with EA. It's Spore Islands. It's Spore for Facebook, for those of you who know Spore. I just want to talk for 1 second about where it came from in part, which was thinking about the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is that part of Canada that got kind of sealed off from the rest of the world a long time ago, like older than this building. And although there's a lot of fossils in there that are things that we recognize, there's also a whole bunch of stuff in there that kind of like took its own track. These are some conceptions of the things that are in there, one of the sort of interesting things is, you know, what happens. Ultimately, the ecosystem within the Burgess Shale was not self-sustaining, but it created a kind of parallel world under parallel conditions in which these creatures evolved. And that was part of the inspiration for Spore Islands, which is where you make your creature on Facebook. You give it certain evolutionary traits, or basically creating the DNA for it. It's then let loose in not just in your ecosystem, but in all the parallel ecosystems of all your friends. And how it does is relative to all the other life forms in those particular ecosystems, right? So it's taking the idea of Facebook and saying, okay, yeah, these are really, it's like the Burgess Shale, but it's like, 300 million Burgess Shales. And to actually kind of bring that to life through not just the metaphor, but the actual process of evolution. Here, in this particular case, my creature did poorly and was beaten by Grazer. And I can look to see what stats Grazer has. And in order to actually succeed here, I would have to evolve. I would have to change the stats that my creature has in order to actually be able to survive, thrive, and move on. And that kind of survival through mutation is sort of what's interesting, and that's what we'll come back to shortly. Most of the games that we make, or at least the games that we started off making, look more like this. This is a game that we did in Tokyo in 2005. This is called Superstar. This is a game that uses Purikura, which are these tiny little stickers. This was popular in the US for about 10 minutes in 1999. These little stickers, which still go up, little stickers of your face, and we use some basically surplus military surveillance software on the server to detect when somebody who's playing the game photographed your particular photo. If you put your sticker up in Tokyo and somebody photographs it, you would get a message that said you just got 100 points. So you're putting up your little stickers around Tokyo in order to kind of get famous in this kind of parallel mini Tokyo. That's sort of, shoved into the little interstitial points within that. This is more sort of where we come from, and it cuts to the core of sort of what we're interested in, which is that everything is always somehow about the connection between something physical in the world connecting out to the cloud, right? There's something that has something to do with the real connecting out. That's where our name came from, and it really just about that connection between the area and the code. As you heard, I came out of media. I came out of advertising. There was always like the media group, and then there was the digital media group, and everybody has their own separate P&L and all those things. And I have no idea whether that makes sense. But what we were interested in is that there's all these technologies in the middle that aren't really about either one. They're really about the connectivity between the two. And some of these you know, and some of these you don't, and whatever. But that these are going to open up new ways to play. And so we started making, as my co-founder and partner Frank said it very early on, games with computers in them rather than the other way around. Games that are not about taking you further and further into the fictive world of Grand Theft Auto or World of Warcraft, but actually about changing how you move in the world itself. So within that, one of our practices is really this idea of games for cities. And it's something we've been around for 5 years. It's something we've sort of been dancing around since a long time. But it has now kind of gained a kind of currency. And they look like a lot of different things, and I'll be getting into what they do. But I want to actually take the opportunity to talk about what working on these games for cities. These are games for the city of Biloxi, the city of Charlotte, Macon. We're working with the Department for Transport here in London. And it means that we spend a lot of time in all these cities. And so I've been spending a lot of time in America, like America, like the soft, squishy parts in the middle. So it's Detroit. Yeah, exactly. Kentucky. And this is like America, right? This is the view from our friend's apartment. America, of predatory loans and NASCAR and fast food and big guns. And then horse country here in Kentucky. It was in Kentucky that I was doing a bunch of research, and that's where I really started thinking about mutants. You would understand if you were there. This was originally a talk about mutants, and it's changed over time, which I feel is kind of perfect. But Kentucky is very specific because there are real mutants there. They're called the Appalachian Blues. These are people who have lived in Kentucky for a few hundred years in more or less complete isolation from the rest of the world. And they're so inbred because of their isolation that they actually turned bright blue. I'm going to show you one photo of what they look like. I find these very difficult to look at, so I can't leave it on the screen. But these are the blues. But we'll stay with this. But real mutants. There's a lot of stuff that I make up in this, but this is not part of it. They're mostly from this one area called Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, which is your clue from the name that the world might be smaller than you like. And they have a very, very rare disease called methemoglobinemia, which is really, really hard to get, but much easier if your sister is your daughter and, like these types of things, right? So basically, once you start inbreeding, you can pass on this mutant gene all the way into nothingness, which is sort of, we think of mutants as the kind of path to diversity, when we tell ourselves the story of evolution, right? Mutations are what's necessary to actually progress and so on. And sometimes that is the case, but what I'm interested in are the mutants that come from the lack of diversity, that come from monoculture, like in Troublesome Creek. And what I've been interested in are the mutants that come at the end of a cycle, rather than at the beginning of one. The mutants that kind of shut the thing down, slow and quiet. So this is Detroit. And we're here. It's a city that's shrunk from 2 million people in 1967 to 800,000 today. 17% unemployment. It's the third poorest zip code in the United States is in Detroit. So that means Troublesome Creek is like way better somehow. This is some images from it. I don't know if I have to draw your attention to the fact that these skyscrapers have trees growing on them already. And these are the mutants, right? The half house, half tree. It's a mutation all of its own. It's like it's not a tree and it's not wood. It's this thing that's in between. And this is what caused it, right? This is the monoculture and the incest, the inbreeding, right, that produces the mutant. This is a car company, the Packard plant. They went bankrupt in '58. I think most people don't think about it, but there were like over 200 car companies in Detroit that went bankrupt much quicker. This is what they were doing, right? They were producing endless copies of things, right? Endless copies of things in an isolated environment, totally isolated from the outside world, like the blue people of Kentucky. They're just making things, replicating them over and over again, and making artifacts. And this is the factory, right? It's an artifact that makes artifacts. And I was thinking about this in part because I've had a bunch of different lives, and one of them was as an artist, and for a couple years. And I had a studio. This is not my studio by any means, but my studio looked like anybody else's. It's not, it's not a coincidence, right, that artists end up working in former factories. It's not a coincidence that the artifact-making artifacts get turned over to the smallest possible entrepreneurs, as Boys called them, where they engage in a much smaller scale manufacturing process of their own. And then it's no coincidence, right, that at the end of the economic cycle in which the entire American manufacturing industry starts to slow to a close, mutations emerge, right, in which an artist's studio is actually called the factory, right, as if that's what we're to aspire to. Right? And that's the kind of mutation that's like the plant that flowers right before it dies. And that's the mutant at the end of the cycle of the 19th and 20th century production. Wasn't there at the beginning of the thing, he was there at the end. And it's like, when I look at these now, actually, and think about the spirit in which they were produced, I think about these, right? I mean, I think about the relationship between this type of replication and production and the type of monoculture that it produces and where that ends up. And I would argue it's unhealthy. It's dying out. It's dead. Here we are in Detroit, and there's blocks. And the time that I spent there, people kept saying, "God, it's like Beirut." And it's like, I have friends in Beirut. They don't. It doesn't look like that. And what it reminded me of actually is London, and not this one, right? But the other one, the 1945, right? And there was a really interesting thing that happened, and I'd be curious how many people grew up with adventure playgrounds. Anybody? Everybody? Yeah. Anybody? Yeah. Okay. All right. So that starts here, 1946. This is Lady Allen of Hurtwood, a landscape architect. She visited Copenhagen, which was building these during the war, and she published this in the Picture Post. Why not use our bomb sites like this? With the idea that in the ruins of the bomb sites would emerge new forms of play. That in these ruins, new things were being made possible for kids. And so the original spirit of adventure playgrounds, looks like this. I guess this is great because I don't have to explain it when I'm in London. This was 1978. This was one in Denmark that it's amazing what kids can do. This is one of the images from the article in the Picture Post back in 1946. I think it's, and this is, by the way, just to speak very directly, this is Roy Kozlowski at Columbia and Princeton is really doing some of the most interesting work about the history of the adventure playground, and this is from some of his collection. I mean, can you imagine a playground, that, right? I mean, it's really, this idea of safety kind of has fallen away, right? We have a new idea, which is best exemplified by the Sheffield map, which Alice Taylor was the first to expose me to this, but it's floated around. This is 4 generations of Sheffield residents that show how far were they able to walk when they were 8 years old, alone, right? And the great-grandfather George was allowed to walk 6 miles to go fishing. His son about 1 mile on his own to the woods. And by the way, what you see also is the migration out of the city into the suburbs over 4 generations, right? Jack, a mile on his own into the woods. The mother, half a mile away to the swimming pool. Her son, this is contemporary, Ed, now 8, allowed to walk on his own to the end of his street 300 yards. Right? 300 yards is, we're far from this, very far. It's true in Sheffield, it's true in Detroit, it's true in New York City. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but the most relevant is that public space, space that's designed for the public to engage with, doesn't produce value the way that factories produce value. And using those instruments of measurement, it never stood a chance. In any case, territory, kids' territory, the types of territory that we just saw, it's primarily a psychological construct that has enforcement through physical means. The thing that's interesting is that that's shifting, right? It's like the things that enforce territory have been things like walls. The things that subvert territory are things like tunnels. And that's changing. This is one of our greatest projects. When I say our, I mean the taxpayers of the United States of America. This is the wall that's being constructed on the border with Mexico. It's getting a test run. It's just a light fence as opposed to the huge monolithic walls that are being considered. It's just a series of really aggressive sensors, right? And this is our super interesting sentient future that we're looking at. And the idea that what the wall does is rather than physically prevent you, it senses, right? And that the sensing is itself what defines territory. And one of the things, there's a project that I saw very recently that if this is what now equates to a wall, this is what now equates to a tunnel. This is something called the Transborder Immigrant Tool. This is coming out of UCSD, Ricardo Dominguez. The Transborder Immigrant Tool would add a new layer of agency. It's basically a phone with GPS on it that's programmed exactly how to cross the border for Mexican immigrants who need to bypass these sensors, right? So there's these sensors, and now there's these sensors, right? And that, you know, that the idea of territory and the definition of territory and the prohibition of territory, all of this is shifting in every direction, but it's shifting along informatic lines, right? And they're actually producing these, and I think they can get the unit cost down to like $35. They're training people how to use them. It's a pretty interesting project. This is in practice right now, Path Intelligence. How many people know about the company? Okay, so this is active in the UK. It's a UK company. Path Intelligence is basically scanning everybody's cell phone. They can set up what are called GNU radios. It's a digital radio that listens for that little ping that your cell phone sends out. You can hear it when there's a speaker on or whatever. They can locate every single cell phone with 1 meter precision. You don't have to be doing anything on it. It's just about saying, okay, this is a mall situation, shopper concentration. This can tell you exactly how many people are where. So the point I want to make about this is, because this is in practice right now, is that you don't have to run for the border to experience this type of thing. You're already there, here, right now. Internet Eyes, right? This is up and running as of a couple days ago, I believe. This is a game that you can play, evidently, in which you can try to find things that are going wrong through the CCTV cameras of London, because that is a fun game. And here they are recruiting businesses to feed their security camera data out to the people who want to play. This is HERO. What does HERO stand for? High Efficiency Retail Observation. Clients like Baskin-Robbins, Dunkin' Donuts, just turn all your security camera data over to the internet itself, and we'll get millions of people to watch and make sure that nobody is shoplifting, that your employees are there on time, et cetera. That this role is being delegated unto all of us through informatic means. This is the MLPR. Never mind. The thing that's interesting, this is Jan Chipchase's photo and anecdote. The question is, if that's what the walls look like, what do the forms of resistance look like, right? And they look kind of more like this. Like, what are the ways to undermine that using the very same tools? The same way that the Transborder Migration tool undermines the sensors. What are the ways to get at this? So this is Graffiti Research Lab. This is using a laser pointer and a projector to project paint onto buildings using a laser pointer. This is geocaching. These are people who are going around the world, going to specific points on lat long, looking for these Tupperware containers that have usually Pez dispensers in them, inexplicably. And the thing is that nobody really cares what's in there. You take whatever's in there, you leave something for somebody else. The thing that's really interesting about geocaching, first of all, who plays it? Second of all, it's not about the thing, it's about the place. And what you have is 2 million people who are curating the world for each other. And that's kind of exciting. This is OpenStreetMap, which starts with Steve Coast here in London, because all of your map data is evidently owned by the government, not anymore. So this is generated by everybody walking around with the very same equipment that this guy's using, with the very same equipment that Mexican immigrants are using, to generate maps from the ground up. That if we can't get that information from the top down, we'll make it. And the point is that the instrumental nature of the city used to derive primarily from industry and its use of land and resources, right? And now they're kind of seeping out of that into policy and politics and code. And the means of de-instrumentalization of that is using some of the very same technologies. If we get away from the instrumental, if we get away from those mutants, from the incest of manufacture, et cetera, and move on, because there's other modes and methods and motivations for design. And the question is, can we do for streets what that part I didn't show you does for objects? Can we change where people go the same way we can change what they buy and sell? Can we change the value of a street corner the same ways we can change the value of a tin of shoe polish, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer is fuck yes. And that games have always done that, right? That's what games are for. And when I say games, I mean like, you know, games. And games with people in them, right? Because this is a really important thing, right? Which is that if you think about games in the continuum of computer science, this is my partner Frank talks about this very frequently. That if you look at games in the continuum of computer science, they're kind of like a special type of software, right? But if you look at them in the continuum of games, 4,000 years or so, right? They're really just a special kind of game, right? And to understand them as within the continuum of something like this, you start to understand that actually there was this really weird period, like 1975, let's say, to around 2000, where people played games alone, right? That was actually really weird. That's a very special point in the history of games. In general, before 1975 or so, if you played a game, you were playing it with somebody. There's exceptions. People play golf and solitaire or whatever. But in general, that's what games were for. They were for social interaction. And then there was this brief moment where what the computer did was to simulate that interaction. And now they've moved into a much more interesting role, which is to connect us to other people again. That's what games are for. That's what they do so effectively. And computers have changed the ways that we can do that. But again, within the continuum of what they've always done. This is the World Game by Buckminster Fuller, which I'll tell you about another time. You have ideas in your head of what video games look like, but this isn't really what video games look like these days, right? They look, I mean, of course they still do, but they also look like this, right? They also look like this. They also look like this. This is what you get if you search online for images of video games. This is a bunch of librarians playing Rock Band. And the thing that is easy to miss, right, is that when you see a picture like this looks like a solitary activity, but if you look at the headphone and the mic, well, he's playing with, like, I don't know, probably 15 other people, right? And that this thing that looks like a solitary activity, if you're looking at it, is so different than what it means to participate in it, because what you're doing when you're participating in it is that you're connected to everybody else in real time, right? This is changing, mutating, shifting to a world in which games, as they become physical again, like the Wii, like Rock Band, et cetera, they're connecting us back together in real space, right? You know, like Rock Band is for a bunch of people to play together. That's what it's for. And the thing that's interesting is this sort of weird hybrid, which is that real space is expanding. The real space in which we are connected to each other electronically and physically is expanding. And that has a lot to do with phones and other stuff. The interesting thing about this photo, although there's many interesting things about this photo, the interesting thing about this photo is that this is like a lot of other photos that you get if you search for video games online. And what you're looking at here is not what they are looking at. And that used to be the image of video games, right? It used to be the screen, right? Like, what does a video game look like? Oh, it looks like that shot of Grand Theft Auto. What does a video game look like now? It looks like the people who are playing it. It's not what they're looking at. That's not the game, and it never was the game, right? The game was always what they were doing, right? And that's much easier to read when they've got, like, plastic guitars in their hands, but it was always the case, right? It was always the case that what it means to play a game is to do something, not to look at something, and it's deceptive in that way. And that's what's interesting, right, is the doing. So it's what you do, not what you look at when you play games. And so I'll talk to you about what we do. This is the first thing we did. This is when we first started about 5 years ago. This is Conquest. This was the first ever use of optic codes in North America. I wish it was the last, and it just doesn't die. There were a lot of reasons to be interested in this, but this was a game in which only the kids who had the special phones, we were doing this to promote a cell phone company, only the kids who had the special phones could actually use that, right? So it was this thing that was like visible to everybody, but only legible to the kids in the game. And that idea of a kind of public secret is really powerful somehow, right? You know, like a city that has different texts for different people explicitly, right? I mean, that's always the case, but to do that explicitly. So it was kind of like the coolest media buy ever with Lost posters and small space ads. And we went to high schools and we recruited kids and we taught them how to play the game. And this is what it looks like to play the game. They're basically unlocking these codes through the special cell phones. We can tell which phones are hitting which servers. This is what comes back. I always make this point because it's really important. It wasn't a scavenger hunt. Because scavenger hunts are basically bad. They're basically poorly designed. A scavenger hunt, if you think about it, it's a series of instructions that somebody will complete at a certain point, and then everybody else goes home, right? That's bad, right? One person wins, you know, 5 million people lose at a random point in their journey, and it's implicitly tactical. It's you do this thing, and then you do the next thing, and you do the next thing, and that's no more interesting in a game than it is in real life. What games are about is a series of decisions and forms of engagement with other people, where you're trying to figure out, in part, what they might be thinking about, and figure out. So, you know, Bighorn here, the orange team is on the move actually from Zone 5 to Zone 8 to box in Team Mountain Lion, because the truth is you can only unlock those codes when you've taken possession of that zone. It's a game, like many games, about territory, right? It's what a lot of games deal with. So one of the ways, in fact, the way that you assume territory in this game is with, of course, a 25-foot high totem animal, which this is how it looks in Portland. If you want to take over somebody else's territory, that's a base challenge. In this case, Bighorn Sheep won. And it's the idea of games that kind of like turn the city upside down, or at least maybe like 15 degrees, 17 degrees. To build software for cities, right? To like think of the built environment as the hardware, right? That's the stuff that comes with the city when you buy it, right? And then the question is, what do you run on top of that, right? And if indeed much of the world's meaning is being derived and produced by these informatic means, that's software, right? And so what does the software look like for cities? And the software that we're interested in is entertainment software, of course. We like a lot of our work is commercial. I'm going to show very little of that tonight. This is Crossroads. This was for an exhibition at the Van Allen Institute in New York in 2006. This comes from a long history about Mardi Gras, which we'll do next time. It was a love letter to Jane Jacobs. This is her neighborhood, and Hurricane Katrina, bitch, that had just ruined New Orleans. This is a two-player game. It takes place over half an hour. This was really kind of the first ever game that used GPS. Two-player game, half an hour. The sun player in the lower right, moon player in the upper left. You are trying to capture as many intersections as possible on that map within that half hour. The way that you capture an intersection is by moving through it. Your move in the game is to move through the city. This is what it looked like on the phone. Again, this is really like these were like some of the worst phones available, but we could actually touch the GPS chip 3.5 years ago. In the game, these two players, the sun player and the moon player, are moving through the streets. They are trying to capture as many street corners as possible. They're trying to avoid the Papa Bones, which is this little skull over on the left. Now, the sun represents a real person, a real player. The moon represents a real player. Those pixels represent computer code. They're in the same plane of consciousness, even. And we noticed this really amazing thing. I mean, like it was like a real discovery when we did it, which is that if you're the sun player, and you notice this with NavSat all the time, if you're the sun player, and you see that the moon player has moved into your line of sight, right? You might be looking down, and you see that he's moved into your line of sight. It's impossible to not look up and greet him or greet her. It's like some weird human impulse that has something to do with being hunted at some point, no doubt. But when you are aware that you can see the moon player, you look up. It is also true that when Papa Bones comes onto Clarkson Street into your line of vision, your peripheral line of vision, people will turn and to look for this thing that isn't there, right? And that's a very weird human tick that I've never seen exploited before or since. Here's Papa Bones. This is what it looks like to play the game in Manhattan. And this is what it looks like to play the game. These are players who are running down Morton Street being pursued by something invisible. Okay? And to be able to produce those kinds of experiences in which the movement in your body is produced by computer code is sort of powerful. I mean, it's very different than what's at the US-Mexican border, but it's also not that different. I like to show this. This is when Frank was working on some of the game dynamics. I would like to show it because a lot of what we do is super high-tech, but it's not really about high-tech whatever. It's just using that to create experiences. And they always start with game design, right? Like, you know, that they're fundamentally game design problems that just have new forms of expression out in the world. I also like to show this. This is debugging. When the Sun player doesn't show up on the screen, it could be that our server in Chicago went down. It could be that we've lost connectivity to the crappy American cell phone networks. It could be that we can't see 3 satellites because of the way New York is constructed, not optimized for satellites, evidently. So you never know, and so you need to find a spot where you know you can connect to all 3, satellites, cell phone network, and the server. This is a donut shop that had leaky Wi-Fi from somebody's apartment above, and we had a clean shot. So this is what debugging looks like. You can't do it from your desk. You can't do it. It's like it's actually situated, right? The problem with situating software in the world is that debugging it requires similarly situated practice. So I don't recommend it to everybody. So another way that we talk about the kinds of things that we do is we say that they're systems that leak, like systems that are hard-coded, but then they leak something out. This is Shark Runners, what we did for the Discovery Channel. This is it's a very conventional video game in many respects. You play it in a browser. You are a marine biologist. You're looking for sharks. You're trying to gather data about them, et cetera, et cetera. And so you name your boat, and you put your crew together, and then you set out a course for your ship to try to intersect with these sharks that you see there. There's 2 important things about the game, and it looks like I'm only going to talk about one of them, which is that all the ships in the game are actually controlled by players. So your ship will obey whatever it is you tell it to do. All the sharks in the game are actually controlled by white sharks in the Pacific Ocean that have GPS transceivers stapled to their dorsal fin. So effectively, what you're doing when you're playing is kind of a game of tag with a bunch of white sharks in the Pacific Ocean who have not found a way to subvert that yet. We're working with the Knight Foundation, which comes out of the Knight Ridder newspaper chain in the United States. They're interested in how to produce community engagement in American cities as one of the sort of like core elements in democracy. And historically, they've always been strongly biased towards doing that through local newspapers, and they are no longer as interested in that. They are looking for other means to produce community engagement. That's what brings us to Detroit. And this is absolutely work in progress. Like I have no idea what this is actually going to become, but just to give you a sense of how we're thinking about it, you know, it's funny, like one of the questions is like, what is the image of Detroit going to be for the future? It speaks to something that I was just talking about with Emily, actually. Like how do you imagine what the image of Detroit is going to be? Because it's not automotive anymore, but the whole thing is designed for the technology of the auto. It's also not a city that is super rewarding from a pedestrian point of view, because it's not really designed around that either. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is to take two specific neighborhoods in Detroit and build them up as neighborhoods, in part through competition with each other in a game that uses bikes, right? Because the thing that bikes do is they allow, let's say, 10 kids at a time, the mobility to actually get something out into neighborhood scale without depending on a car and at a tempo that makes it game-like. The bikes will be using something called the Copenhagen wheel, which we're working with the Sensible Cities group at MIT. This is a wheel that's basically loaded with sensors. There'll be a bunch of junk bikes, like really the whole idea here is to make it as cheap as possible. A bunch of junk bikes that have wheels that can tell us exactly where those bikes are and can broadcast that back out to the network and can also broadcast it onto something on the handlebars that somehow will allow 10 kids on bikes who, like in Crossroads, can't see each other because that's the idea, right, is that it has this neighborhood scale. They can't see each other, but they can see where each other are, right? So it's a game that 10 on 10 kids are going to be playing at an urban scale using bikes, capturing territory from each other. Not sure exactly how that's going to work out. But part of the idea here among the ideas of neighborhood, et cetera, but part of it is also to take the image of something that's kind of like, old and like out of date, like biking, right? The thing that got replaced by everything else, and to make that future facing, right? To say that like, yeah, all you need to do is just put a bunch of shit in the wheel, right? And now it's, a sentient networked object, right? That can bring you into communication and play with everybody else who's in. And there's something about that image of like, it's like I want bike shops that have a bunch of hackers in them, right? It's like that image, right, of the kind of like DIY crossing over from the real mechanics of bike repair, to debugging the crap Bluetooth sensor on the GPS unit. That feels more like the post-automotive Detroit that kind of interested in and would like to see happen. This is the last thing I'll show, and it's just to say that you don't need satellites either. That one of the most difficult things in everything that we do is how to get the data that we want. And that turns out to be really hard in some cases and really easy in others. When we first started 5 years ago, it was really hard to get a phone that could actually know where it was. And of course, they know where they are all the time, but we couldn't get that data, blah, blah. And so we started working with a company called Skyhook out of Boston. This is like 3.5 years ago when they were sort of first getting off the ground. And what they do is they've driven vans around and they've mapped every single Wi-Fi router in the United States. They've done it here as well. So every single Wi-Fi router around you has a latitude and longitude associated with it. That means all you need is a little bit of software on your machine to tell you exactly where your PC is, where your laptop is, where your camera is, right? Where anything that can see Wi-Fi can suddenly be precisely located, if you permit it to be, without touching a cell phone network, without touching satellites, without touching any of that. That's really interesting. So they approached us and they asked if we could do a game with that, and we said, sure, we'd like to do something with one of our favorite games, which is Dope Wars, which was the #1 download for the Palm Pilot, for those of you who had a Palm Pilot. Dope Wars is a game of arbitrage in which you move from one area of New York to another, buying and selling cocaine, heroin, and PCP. The values of those commodities vary from territory to territory, and every time you make a move, you risk capture by the cops or all kinds of other exciting things that happen to drug dealers, and in a spreadsheet form. And one of the things that's really interesting about Dope Wars is how effective it was. I mean, like it was the #1 download, right? And a lot of people played it. I played it a lot. There was something just in the simple act of just negotiating arbitrage in a fictional space that's somehow a little bit compelling. And we were like, oh, so every PC can know where it is. We'll just do a real geolocated Dope Wars. Where if you want to get the cheap heroin, you actually have to go to Brooklyn. And so we came back to them and we said that's what we'd like to do. And they said that that what they would like out of this is that when people are first finding out about their product through Google or whatever. It's not through Heroin, Brooklyn, et cetera. And we said, OK, how about pirates? And they said yes. And we said, great, we're off. So we made a pirate-themed geolocated Dope Wars. This is basically Dope Wars, but it's pirate-themed, where you are on an island. And so we broke up the world into a 6-block grid that's, again, purely informatic, right? It's like, we didn't have to do anything to the built environment. We just said, it's this big, it extends like this. And if you're the first person to play the game using your PC or any Wi-Fi-enabled device, you get to claim that island, right? So the person who landed at Hobo Island first got to call it Hobo Island. And then, of course, there's many. This is the thing. Like, you unleash a system, and it just starts to unwind and start to pull people in. This is near where our office is. This island is called Panto Rico, discovered by a player named Pants, which I understand is a naughty word in these parts. Sorry. And every island that you're on, like Dope Wars, has its own commodities and relative prices, right? So on Panto Rico, bananas are really cheap, but gunpowder is really expensive. Where I live in Brooklyn, gunpowder is really, really cheap, right? So I have a trading run between my home in Brooklyn and the office in Manhattan. And the thing is that we're moving, fictional goods around real space, right? And we see all kinds of really weird behavior. We see people, because we get a little feed like every time and we'll see people who just like go on a tear discovering islands, and they'll spend like 6 hours just doing that, right? Because then they own them and they get the taxes on them, and all kinds of benefits in this fictional world, and that it can actually change. There's a player who has a living room, who has an apartment in New York that's improbably large enough to straddle between 2 islands. So he has a trading route between his living room and his kitchen, which is bullshit, if you ask me. So you do something like this, and you let it loose, and people just start to do their own thing. And so people are just building all these fictional islands all over Manhattan, and then it kind of spread, and then it kind of kept spreading, and then it really spread far, and then it came to Europe. And the thing is that, we didn't make these. People just made them. We just made the system from which these things emerged. And that's what we're trying to build, right? Not things, right? Not replicating something over and over and over again, but like a system that can actually produce things kind of on its own, a system that actually like brings people together specifically through play. And that if this is sort of what you're aiming for, if you can build this kind of system, I believe strongly that this is part of the antidote. Because if there's one lesson out of the factories of Detroit and the factories of 20th century art production, it's that designers can move away from designing the things themselves. It's not simply about that these things that replicate in isolation. That the designing the things over and over and over again end here, right? They end with this kind of mutant over here. But the thing that is so fascinating to bring this back to Detroit is that if you just turn the corner from this sadness, and I mean actually like turn the corner, you see this, right? And same elements, different designer, right? Same stuff, different designer. It's nature and houses, it's urban, it's not. But the difference is that this is productive rather than consumptive, right? And these are the kinds of systems that we're interested in. It's just that there is an informatic analog to this, right? So this is the corn that's growing like in the middle of a metropolitan city. Like right in the middle. And it feeds the people in the neighborhood who might not be able to get healthy food easily some other way. And what I would argue is that this is what designers do now. That the new modes of production look more like this than the factories that they're replacing. That they're living systems, and that they should be designed to feed us, right? In one way or another. That, rather than to build the things that we consume, we should build the things that feed us. And I just believe that whether it's games or not, that's the designer's job.